My stubborn will at last have yielded. I would be thine and thine alone. And this a prayer my lips are bringing, for within me thy will be done. Sweet will of God, still clothe me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Sweet will of God, still clothe me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. I'm tired of sin, but sore and weary, the darksome path and weary road. But now life has risen to cheer me. I find in thee my star, my sun. Sweet will of God, still hold me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Sweet will of God, still hold me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Shut in with thee, O Lord, forever. My wayward feet no more to roam. What far from thee my soul can sever? The cinder of God fill my home. Sweet will of God, still hold me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Sweet will of God, still hold me closer till I am wholly lost in thee. Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, brutal Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his holy name. Salvation has been brought down. Praise the Lord, salvation has been brought down. Go and shout and tell the world around. Today, tell For the throne
had the dream.
Be my friend, keeping me to the end, guiding my steps so freely, showing His love so deeply, with joy I'll follow Him in all the way He did, teaching my friends and loved ones He is the way.
Would have been young, probably around 18, somewhere in that range, 18 years old. The second encounter is probably just a few years later after that, and that's when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get thrown into the fiery furnace. And that also would have been early in his reign. At least most scholars think that. It doesn't exactly say what year it was. But if that's the case, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have probably been in their early 20s, something like that, when that happened. And so that's chapter 3. So now we're going to go into chapter 4, and this is going to be, again, it doesn't say when this is, but most scholars speculate that this is going to be later in the king's reign. So Nebuchadnezzar reigned for a long time as king. And unfortunately, there's not nearly as much historical documentation for the last 30 years of his reign as king, so you don't really know when this happened exactly. The other thing about ancient Near Eastern rulers, all of their, what you call the annals, a lot of them would dictate these annals that they would put in their library, which is kind of a way of documenting the stuff they did. It was all written in propaganda style, so they would only say things positive about themselves. A lot of times it was embellishment and lies even. And so for the things that are going to happen, we're going to see here in chapter 4, they would never record this because this is not fitting with how you want to present the king or have the king remembered. So don't expect archaeology to ever uncover information about this particular period. There is one piece of archaeology that maybe alludes to it, a historian, but it's supposedly it's a fragmented artifact and it's incomplete and it's kind of hard to exactly know what it's referring to. So as far as historical evidence goes, there's really not a lot of historical evidence for this. But again, I'm just saying all that to say it's not surprising because they would not have recorded this anyway. So what we're going to see in chapter 4 is the third encounter between Yahweh and Nebuchadnezzar. And then most scholars think, like I said, this is going to probably happen maybe about 30 years into his reign as king. So he's going to be an older king at this point. And Daniel, in this part of the story, Daniel's probably about 50 years old now. So a lot has happened in between chapter 3 and chapter 4 that isn't recorded. And so Daniel, if assuming Daniel is the author, Daniel is now going to jump forward about 30 years and record this story. Now the thing in chapter 4, there's some interesting things about it that I kind of started to talk about last week right at the end of class. So chapter 4 of Daniel is the only chapter in the Bible written by a pagan. So King Nebuchadnezzar is the author of this chapter, or at least Daniel is writing it from King Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. He probably wrote this or something similar to it. And so you can basically attribute this chapter to the king. And so again, this is the only chapter or text in the Bible that is actually written by a pagan. So that makes it rather unique. The other thing is the chapter is going to open and then close with what you call a doxology, meaning it's like a praise to God. It looks kind of like a poem. So he's going to open with that and he's going to close with that. And then in between those two doxologies, Nebuchadnezzar is going to recall the story. Okay, so he's going to open with a doxology, which is him talking about how great God is. But remember, this is all written after the fact. So he's not going to be praising God this way until the story is actually over with. Okay, so it's him opening and closing with similar thoughts with the story in between. But the story in between is what leads him to finally acknowledge God the way he does at both the beginning and the end of the chapter. I think that was most of the comments I kind of want to make on this. So again, later in Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Daniel's probably about 50 years old at this point. And we're going to see as we get into it, Daniel is, so if you remember back in chapter 2, when Daniel interpreted the dream for the king immediately promoted him to chief of the magicians and basically the head over the whole province of Babylon. What we're going to see in this chapter is Daniel is still in that position, okay? So he has held that rank for probably 30 years, and so he has a very good relationship with the king. And it's very clear as you read this that he and Daniel and the king get along. They seem to like each other, and they kind of seem to be friendly with each other. And so that kind of becomes apparent as you go through this. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start. So the first 3 verses are the doxology. One other thing, I knew there was something else I was forgetting. So almost the entire chapter is written in first person. So this is Nebuchadnezzar talking, except for a really small section in the middle. And if you don't remember this story, this is a story where basically God takes the king's sanity away from him, and he's going to live in the field like a wild animal for a period of time. And so what happens in this chapter is the king is writing this. He writes it all in first person, except for the section where you might say he loses his sanity for a period of time. And he writes that in third person because he's not in his right mind during that time. And then as soon as he comes out of that and his mental state is restored to him, he goes back to first person. So it's kind of a literary style that he chooses to write this in. Okay, so verse 1 of chapter 4, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. And so that's a very typical statement for an Assyrian or a Babylonian king. They thought they ruled the entire world, and in a sense, they did rule most of the known world at the time. But they thought very highly of themselves. They thought they were the most powerful people in the world, and they probably were. At least Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful person in the world at that time. So he's writing this edict to basically to his whole kingdom, to basically tell the kingdom what happened to him, okay, and to praise God in the process of it. Which, if you think about that for a pagan king, that's pretty startling. That, you know, if you think about various rulers around the world today, would they write anything like this? And the answer is probably no. So he says, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. And then he says, I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. So when he says signs and wonders, what he means are miracles. And he's saying, I want all of my people and all my kingdom to know about the miracles that the Most High God has done for me. And who is the Most High God? Well, if you remember, we talked about this off and on. So he is a worshiper of Marduk. His name, though, has the god Nabu in his name. So Nabucodonosor is his name. So his father was a worshiper of Nabu and named him after his favorite god. But Nebuchadnezzar is a worshiper of Marduk, and he names his son after Marduk. So his son is, depending on which version of his name you look at, it's evil Marduk or Awil Marduk. In the last chapter of Kings, 2 Kings, he's called evil Marduk is the way it's written in English. Doesn't mean he's an evil guy. And evil Marduk means man of Marduk in Akkadian. And so he's a worshiper of Marduk. But what you're seeing now is, now that he has finally had 3 different encounters with Yahweh over this 30-year period of time, he is shifting from acknowledging Marduk as the main god to worshiping or acknowledging Yahweh as the Most High God. Now, for them in that time and that way of thinking, that is an astonishing thing to acknowledge because, just like we talked about last week, they thought that a god only had power inside of the border that god occupied. So Yahweh occupied, in their way of thinking, Yahweh occupied Judah. And so Yahweh only had power in Judah, not outside the borders of the territory of Judah. And since he, Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon had defeated Judah, that meant his God was stronger than Yahweh, okay? And his God would be Marduk. And what he is acknowledging now over this 30-year period of time where he's had these multiple encounters with Yahweh is that not only is Yahweh strong outside of Judah, he actually is strong throughout the whole world, and he is stronger than Marduk, his God, okay? And that has taken him a long time to acknowledge. Is he at this point now a Yahweh-only worshiper? And that question is hard to answer. Is he still a polytheist, or is he a one God only kind of guy at this point, and he only worships Yahweh? It doesn't say, so I can't really speculate. But he is basically proclaiming that Yahweh is, if nothing else, the supreme of all of the gods, if not the only God. Okay, and so that's a really startling thing for him to admit once you kind of think about it in the context of the culture at the time and how they thought about things. Okay, so he's going to go on to say in verse 3, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders, again, the miracles that Yahweh does. He says his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. And that's also a very startling thing for him to say, because who is the most powerful man in all the world at this point? It's him. So for him to acknowledge that his kingdom is not the greatest kingdom, that it's Yahweh's kingdom is the greatest kingdom, is very startling and very interesting for him to admit this, okay? But he's only admitted it because he's been brought to humility over a 30-year period that only Yahweh can do, okay? So he's finally come to the point that he can admit that Yahweh's kingdom is greater than his kingdom, okay? So that's the doxology at the beginning. So now he's going to start telling the actual story that led him to be able to make that statement we just read, okay? And that's basically the most of the rest of the chapter until you get to the very end where you have a final doxology again. So we're going to look at the story in between now that led him to be humbled to that point that he could make that statement. Okay, so it starts off, it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I'll talk a little bit more about the city of Babylon itself once we get a little deeper into the chapter. But basically what he's saying is he's just, relaxing in his palace. So he had 3 palaces in the city, but he's relaxing in one of the palaces. Maybe it's the one that looks out over the hanging gardens, which we'll talk about later a little bit. And so he's able to relax, kind of kick back, think about all the great things he's accomplished, all the kingdoms he's taken over, destroyed, all the people he's conquered, and how great of a city he has built there in Babylon, which would still rival most cities even today. And so he built that into this great city, this great nation that he's built. And so he's kind of reveling in his own success at this point. All right, so verse 5, it says, I saw a dream which made me afraid. So if you remember, chapter 2, he had a dream as well that made him also very afraid. So God is doing kind of a similar thing that he did back in chapter 2. So going on in verse 5, it says, And the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. So again, this is very similar to chapter 2, but we see one big difference here. In chapter 2, he demanded that the magicians and these different guys that he called in tell him both the dream and the interpretation. And he's not doing that this time. He is actually going to tell them the dream and then just ask them to give him the interpretation. You can speculate why he's not as strict this time around. Remember, the first time it was very early in his reign, and the dream itself seemed to have created some suspicion in him about a coup perhaps being launched at him or whatever, and so he wanted, if there was a coup being launched, he wanted the guilty parties to be found out. but he also was testing his astrologers and so forth to see if they actually were communicating with the gods. And if they were, then they should be able to tell him both the dream and the interpretation. He's not doing that this time. He's just wanting them to give him the interpretation. Maybe it's because he's been king a long time and he doesn't feel any real threat in terms of a coup. But he is obviously very scared about what the dream means. Okay. All right, so verse 7, it says, "Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation." Now, he's going to say this again later. There's three possibilities of what that means. One, it means they had no idea what the dream meant, or they had some idea of what the dream meant, but they didn't fully know, so they didn't want to speculate. Or they knew exactly what the dream meant, but they were scared to tell the king what it meant. Okay, it could be any of the three. But regardless, they did not tell him what the dream meant. Okay. So then the other question is, well, why is Daniel not in this group? Daniel is the leader of these guys, the magicians, soothsayers, all these people. So why is Daniel not in the group when the king calls them in? And again, there's speculation on that. One, he may not have been in the palace when the king called for them. You know, he may have been taking care of other business, so he wasn't there at the time. It may be that he only came in and handled things that these guys could not handle, and so he's letting them take the first stab at it. Or it may be that he intentionally held back and let them fumble so that the power of Yahweh would be demonstrated once he comes in and reveals the dream when they could not do so themselves. It's hard to know for sure. It doesn't really say. All right, so verse 8 says, "But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God." So Nebuchadnezzar points out that Daniel's Babylonian name is Belteshazzar, which means Baal protect him, Baal protect, something to that effect. And so it has the name Baal in it. That first part, Baal, Belteshazzar, Baal, is the name Baal. So this gets confusing. You probably don't even care, but I'll tell you anyway. So words are spelled different depending if you're using an Eastern Semitic language or a Western Semitic language. And so Eastern Semitic would be Akkadian, which is where Babylon is. Western Semitic would be Hebrew, Aramaic, and those type languages. So in Western Semitic, Baal is spelled B-A-A-L. In the Eastern Semitic, it's spelled B-E-L. Okay, and that's why his name is B-E-L, not B-A-A-L. But it's still the same God, okay? It's still Baal, what we call Baal. And so it may be referring to Baal, or it may be another way of saying Marduk. Either way, it's a Babylonian god. The interesting thing, though, is it seems ironic to me that his name means Baal protect this person, and yet Baal cannot protect the king. And he has to call on a different god to come in and give the interpretation. So I think that's kind of interesting, that his name kind of hints at that even though the name suggests that Baal is going to protect somebody, Baal is actually incompetent to do the job. And so you have to bring in a different god to serve the purpose here. But as you notice here in this verse, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that he says the spirits or the power of the gods or the holy God is in Daniel, meaning he acknowledges and knows that Daniel communicates with Yahweh, and that's how Daniel is able to interpret the dreams and do these things. He has a gift that the other astrologers and all those guys do not have, okay? And so as you go on in that verse, and it says, "I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. And so now he's going to start telling him what the dream was. It says, these were the visions of my head while on my bed. It says, I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. It could be seen to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant. And in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So in other words, it's just this vision of a tree. The tree grows, gets really big, basically becomes the biggest tree there is, and supplies food for all the animals, all the people, and shade, and so forth. So it's basically the source of all goodness for all people, basically. And so obviously, as you're reading that, this is obviously talking about Nebuchadnezzar himself. Nebuchadnezzar is the tree. And so the vision is about him, becoming this great king. He's able to provide for all of his people, and basically the whole world looks at him as the greatest leader in the world at the time. Okay, so verse 13, it says, I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus. Okay, so what you have here is he sees that it's called a watcher from heaven, sees Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to come down and deliver a message to him in his dream. So what is a watcher? Unfortunately, we don't have time to go too deep into what this is. Probably the easy, short version is it's probably an angel. So the word watcher, what it refers to is, so this is the only place in the Bible this word is used, but it appears in the apocalyptic writings that occur later, between now and when Jesus comes, that some groups consider as scripture, like if you're a Catholic, it will be in your Catholic Bible, but it's not in Protestant Bibles usually. You can get it if you want, but it's not usually printed with Protestant Bibles. So it does appear, this term appears in some of those writings, and what it alludes to, or the idea is that there may be some angels or some type of celestial host that their main job is to sit and watch the earth and watch people, and when ones perhaps step out of line and aren't doing what God would expect them to do, they go inform God that, Paul's an idiot, maybe you need to do something to him, that kind of thing. And so that's kind of the idea here, is that this watcher has been watching Nebuchadnezzar. He's not living the way God wants him to live. He's living too pridefully. And so the idea is that this watcher is going to relay this information up the chain of command, up to God, and then God is going to make a decision then to send an angel or someone down to deliver this message to Nebuchadnezzar. That's kind of the gist of the idea. Now, if you want to delve a little more deeply into this, perhaps the watchers are part of the celestial council, which you can read about in Job chapter 1 and 2. There are lots of theories. Some of them are just, I don't know what the best word is. I'll just say interesting theories on what these things mean. I would not take them all to be fact or truth. There's just not enough knowledge to really know exactly what all this is. So some people take some of this and they speculate and they go to pretty far extremes with some of it and what it all means. Anyway, but if you're interested, you can at least look at Job chapters 1 and 2 and think about think about it if you want to. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of the idea. So now we're going to read this message that this watcher is going to deliver to Nebuchadnezzar in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So remember, he's still dreaming at this point. Okay, so it says, chop down the tree and cut off its branches. So remember, Nebuchadnezzar's the tree, and this watcher is coming in and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do now to the tree. It says, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. So to this point, what you're seeing is basically the tree is going to be destroyed down to the stump. But the roots are still going to be in the ground. You'll still have a stump. And then around it, you're going to have this band of iron and bronze. And that would be kind of similar to, like if you go to a cemetery or some, historical site, and they'll put a fence maybe around a tree stump so you can still see it, but they don't want people going to touch it or damage it in some way. That's kind of what this iron and bronze thing is. It's intended to be around it to protect it, okay? So God, if you remember, so this is going to be Nebuchadnezzar. So the dream is basically saying, okay, I'm going to strip you of everything you've got and humble you, but I'm not going to destroy you. And in fact, I'm going to make sure that you're protected, okay? So despite the fact that I'm going to take everything from you, I'm still going to protect you so that you're not destroyed completely. And that's the idea that he's presenting here. So as you keep looking forward here in verse 15, it says, in the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. And so now he's going to shift from talking about a tree to literally talking about the person. Now it's all the same thought. It's all about Nebuchadnezzar, but we're shifting from this metaphor about a tree to now we're literally going to be talking about the human Nebuchadnezzar himself. So in the middle of verse 15 is where you see this shift. So it says, in the tender grass of the field. In other words, now we're talking about the king, Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to be out in the field. And it says, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. I don't know why it says it. It should be him. He's going to be wet with the dew of heaven, meaning he's going to live out there with the animals. So he's going to be wet every morning with dew, just like they are, because he sleeps out there every night. And it says, let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Grass can mean grass. It can also refer to vegetables and stuff, so it doesn't mean that he only ate grass. It says, let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. So what it's talking about, and we'll keep going here in a second, the idea is God is going to put in him a delusion where he thinks he is like an ox, for instance. This is actually a medical diagnosis that sometimes people get, where they get a delusion and they think they are a particular animal or whatever the case. Sadly, it seems to start becoming a fad. How many people do you see on TikTok or something now that suddenly think they're a dog or they're a cat? I mean, it's the exact same thing as this. So what does this delusion mean? It doesn't mean that he is completely insane, okay? He could still talk, he could still think, he could still do things. It just means he thinks he's an ox, so he's going to eat like an ox and behave like an ox. You obviously can't be king when you're thinking like this, right? But it doesn't mean he's completely lost his mind and he's strung out on drugs or something. It doesn't mean that. So people who get these kind of delusions, they can still carry on a normal conversation with you. They can still rationally think about things, but they have this fixed delusion in their head that they think they are whatever, and they behave like that particular animal. And that's what's happening to him here. And so as you move on into the chapter here, and the 7 times, how long is this going to last? It says 7 times. Some people think that means 7 years. 7 also a lot of times just means a complete period of time. So maybe it's 7 years, maybe it's not. Not really sure. In other words, but the idea is you're going to be this way until you humble yourself. Okay, that when you finally humble yourself, that's when this will stop. And that's really the idea. All right, so verse 17, it says, this decision is by the decree of the watchers. So that term is used one more time here. And it says, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones. In other words, okay, the watchers have kind of brought this to God's attention, but it's actually God's decision to do this, okay? And it says, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. And so what Nebuchadnezzar is saying here, or what the watcher is saying to him, is that this is going to happen to you because of your pride. Because you failed to acknowledge that you were king because God made it so. You think you're king because you think you're so great. You think all this prosperity you have and this great wealth and this great city you built and this great nation you built is all because of you and how great you are and how mighty you are, and that is farthest from the truth. God gave it all to you, and until you figure that out, you can wander around and act like an animal. And that's exactly what's going to happen to him. So, like I mentioned before, there's really not any archaeological evidence to suggest this happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen. It did happen. It's just they're not going to record this in the Babylonian records because they never record anything that makes the king look like an idiot. And so you will never find this information in the Babylonian records because it's just not something they would write down. So what happened during this period of time? Well, most likely what happened is his son stepped in and ruled as king, probably. So his king is, depending on which way you want to pronounce it, we'll just go with the one in the Bible. In the Bible, he's called Evil Merodach. Merodach is the Western Semitic spelling for the god Marduk. So the term Evil Merodach means man of Marduk. You can see his name in the very last chapter of 2 Kings. And it mentions him being king at that point. So probably his son steps in and rules while Nebuchadnezzar has basically lost his mind. And then when he comes back to his sanity, then he will rule again until he dies, and then his son will officially become king at that point. So that's probably what's going to happen. All right, so verse 18, it says, this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare its interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the Spirit of the Holy God is in you. So he's already said this once, but he's saying the same idea again. He knows that Daniel or Belteshazzar has communication with Yahweh, that Yahweh can tell him what the dream means, and then in turn Daniel can relay that information to the king. Okay, so verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and astonished really it means dismayed. And notice it says he's dismayed for a time. In other words, he knows exactly what this dream means, but he's sort of stunned by it, and he doesn't really want to say what it means, okay? And then he goes on and says, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. So Daniel knows exactly what this dream is about. He doesn't want to tell the king what it's about, nor does he want to see it actually come to pass. And it seems to be that the king and Daniel, they have a good relationship, it seems like. And Daniel seems to have respect for him, and he doesn't want to see this happen. And there's some other reasons for that too. So if you go back, when Assyria was the main world power, and they come in and they conquered Israel, the northern kingdom, they took them into captivity, but they scattered them all across Assyria And so all of those Jews got lost to history. Nobody knows who they are anymore. They've just been scattered across the Middle East back at that time. Probably that most, if not all, may have just fallen away from Judaism completely. And so they got lost, okay? And that was the Assyrians' goal. When they would conquer somebody, they wanted to just demoralize those people, make them captives, make them slaves, and they would split them up intentionally so that the group couldn't stay together and possibly revolt or even continue to worship their God. And so that was all intentional, and that was the way Assyria did things. But Babylon took a different approach. So when Babylon comes in and they take Judah, they take the people back to Babylon, but they let them live together in Babylon, in an area together. They congregate together. They allow them to build synagogues there and so forth. And so the Jews are actually treated pretty well in Babylon like a regular Babylonian citizen. And you can tell by the relationship here between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar likes him. I mean, he doesn't really care that he's Jewish. And so what Daniel is also worried about is, okay, we've got it decent. I mean, nobody wants to be captive in another country, but as far as that goes, the Jews have it pretty good in Babylon. And Daniel is concerned in the back of his mind that if this comes to pass and Nebuchadnezzar can't be king, there's no guarantee that the next king is going to treat the Jews as well as this king does, okay? You don't really know how his son is going to rule, or if his son will be terrible and then they fall to another country, which they ultimately do shortly thereafter. And so there is some concern, not only for Nebuchadnezzar himself, but how does this affect the nation? And then in turn, how would that affect the Jews living in the nation? And so there's multiple layers of concern here that Daniel would have. So then let's go on here in verse 20. It says, "The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, and its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home." So he basically retells the whole thing. It says, "It is you." Now, it's interesting. Look at the first sentence fragment of verse 20 and then skip to verse 22. So I'll read it for you. "The tree that you saw," skip ahead, "it is you." Does that sound like any other words from another prophet? Remember when Nathan confronted David and he said, "You're the man." It's the same thing. Okay. Now the difference is Daniel doesn't really want to say that here to Nebuchadnezzar, but it's the same idea. Unfortunately, you're the guy, unfortunately. So verse 22, "It's you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth." Verse 23, "And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, 'Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him.' This is the interpretation." So basically he's rehashed all this stuff. And then we get to 24 and he's going to interpret it. It says, "This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses." So he tells him, okay, you're the guy, and what's going to happen is you're going to get this fixed illusion in your mind. You're going to think you're an animal, and you're going to live out with the animals and eat with the animals, and you're basically going to look like an idiot to your whole kingdom. And you're going to be that way until you finally figure out that God is God and you're not God. And that's basically the gist of what Daniel is having to tell him. Now, as you go on, Daniel offers a bit of hope here. So verse 26, it says, "And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules." In other words, God's not going to strip all this stuff from you. He's going to take it from you for a little while, but he's going to hold it over here till you get your head on straight. And then God will give it all back to you. Verse 27, "Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you." So now Daniel's going to offer advice to him. This is what you should do. "Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity." In other words, Daniel seems to be offering a message of hope here. Maybe if you straighten your life up, maybe God won't actually do this to you. And that's what he's saying. Now, what do you think the answer is going to be? Is Nebuchadnezzar going to straighten up, or is he just going to keep being Nebuchadnezzar? He's just going to keep being Nebuchadnezzar. So I know the next bell is about to ring, so we'll probably stop there. But as you kind of think about this, he is the most powerful man in all the world. And like all humans, he has a pride issue, and particularly all humans in power, he has a really bad pride issue. And so as you look at that and you think about our rulers today, not just in our country, but around the world, what if God did this to them? And the message is not really that God will do this exact thing to them, but God will only have patience with their nonsense for so long until he somehow knocks them off their pedestal in whichever way he chooses to do so, whether that be in our country or in other countries. And so I know we oftentimes get frustrated with this leader or that leader is not acting in a way we would like them to act. But God has a purpose, and he will act in his time in the way he chooses to act to deal with them. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments before we break for the evening? Okay, it's good to see everybody. Hope you have a good week.